Let's examine the Civil War in a new light. What if it never really ended? Not on the battlefield, because we know it did, but in the minds of the people who survived it. Welcome to History Secrets Uncovered. My name is Jay Chandarana, and today I have the honor of speaking with Professor Brian Jordan, a historian of the Civil War, memory, and veterans at Sam Houston State University. Today, we'll discuss how ordinary soldiers experienced the war, why Americans continue to debate its meaning more than 150 years later, and what this history reveals about our country today. Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for joining me.
Jay, thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be a part of this project.
Thank you. Before becoming a historian, what was it about the Civil War that first captured your attention? Was there a particular moment where you realized that this history was something you wanted to dedicate your life to studying?
Well, I've always been a history person. I grew up in Ohio, the cradle of presidents, and spent my early years visiting presidential birthplaces and grave sites and museums. Um, but then when I was 11 years old, I got to know a man in Akron who actually knew very well some of the last surviving Civil War veterans. And in fact, knew the very last surviving Union veteran, Albert Wilson, who lived in Duluth, Minnesota, and died in August of 1956 at the age of 109. And this man would tell me stories about meeting these veterans, and it was something that made the Civil War at once real and immediate for me. That same summer, my family and I went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the site of the war's bloodiest battle. And I think metaphorically, I never left. In fact, I returned to Gettysburg, was an undergraduate at Gettysburg College, and have been studying the conflict ever since.
And your work focuses much more on ordinary soldiers than on famous generals or politicians. Why did you
Mhm.
decide to approach the Civil War from this light and this perspective? And what does it reveal that we often miss?
Well, I'm a social and cultural historian by professional training. So I am keenly interested as a historian in how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. And in the case of the Civil War, right, circumstances that they never could have imagined themselves being a part of. So that's kind of how I approach the story. Not to say that, the tactics and strategy and the ideas of battlefield commanders and the political decisions in the halls of Congress aren't important. They certainly are. But I think getting down onto the ground helps to reveal some really important things about history itself.
Sure,
One, it makes absolutely legible to us just how many contingent choices go into every event, that nothing in the past had to turn out the way that it did. When you study ordinary people and you recognize, right, that they don't understand necessarily the events that they're going through, they, of course, don't know what's coming next. They're peering quite literally through the proverbial fog of battle, trying to make sense of it in real time. And that really, for me, allows us to recover the contingency of the past, to understand again that it didn't have to turn out the way that it did, and that real people can impact the course of events. The choices that they make or conversely don't make really truly matter. And so I'd like to tell those individual stories, stories of ordinary people, because I think um, it brings to the foreground those fundamental historical truths.
yeah, I mean, in our, let's say, our APUS history courses, we cover a very large period of time from spanning
Mhm.
from 1700 up until 2000. That's 300 years and 8 months.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, we kind of have to take that view of looking at the bigger picture, looking at it from these leaders' perspectives. But like you're saying, we often miss all that nuance that comes with looking at it from the battlefield's perspective. And one thing that I found really interesting in Marching Home, one of your works, is that for many Union veterans who were those people on the front lines facing these lived experiences, the Civil War never really ended. How did that
Mhm.
book change your perspective of what it really means for a war to be over?
That's a great question. I think typically when we think about wars and when wars end, right, we think about surrender meetings, we think about treaties, we think about demobilization. And demobilizing armies, relatively speaking, is easy. In the case of the Civil War, right, it offered Union demobilization a kind of a parting shot to federal logistical wizardry, right? 800,000 soldiers were demobilized within 5 months of Appomattox, right? Packed aboard trains and steamers and sent to their homes, the places of their youth. That was easy to do. What was much more difficult is the cultural work, I would argue, of demobilizing minds, right? Of individual soldiers turning away from the war and its violence. So when we think about war, we're often thinking about demobilizing those armies, and we completely paper over this much more complicated and often nonlinear process by which individual soldiers have to turn away from the war, have to reintegrate to civilian life, have to take inventory of the myriad ways in which the war left its impress not just on their bodies and minds, but on their habits, their patterns and perceptions. Um, and that process fascinates me. And I think what what a lot of historians until very recently hadn't uncovered is the reams of original evidence left behind by Civil War soldiers about how exactly um, they did that after the Civil War.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting that this has only recently come to
Hmm.
historians' light because, as we know, history is always evolving. The way we think about the past is always evolving and changing as we discover more. And you've
Yep.
personally spent years studying both the Civil War and the way Americans have remembered it. What do you think
Mhm.
currently is the biggest misconception people have about the war, whether that be something that people used to believe and now is different, or just a straight up misconception that people often have?
I've thought a lot about this question, and I think really the biggest misconception is probably in the name that we give to the war. We think about Civil War as a civil war, when in fact we ought to be thinking about it as an insurrection, a rebellion, a slaveholders' rebellion. And that's a difference that's not just semantical. It's a difference that actually matters quite a lot. There's a historian, Gaines Foster, who's written an excellent recent article about the history of the name that we have given to the Civil War. And in fact, the name Civil War doesn't really start to come into currency until the early part of the 20th century. Union veterans in particular, the soldiers that I write about, they called it the War of the Rebellion. They wanted to make absolutely clear and wanted people to never forget, right, that what southern states, 11 southern states did between 1861 and 1865 was to rebel against the government of the United States in a quest, right, to create a government where all men were not created equal,
Sure.
to create a nation where slavery and white supremacy would be enshrined as the cornerstone. And so I think, just calling it the Civil War actually effaces so much of that history of rebellion, insurgency, treason, slavery, white supremacy. Um, and, that's always been the way that we've wanted to remember the Civil War as this kind of quaint backyard scrimmage, when in fact it was a treasonous rebellion against our country.
Yeah, I think that word treasonous is also very important because outlined in the Constitution, it literally makes secession impossible.
That's right.
So, so the
That's right.
South seceding shouldn't even be possible because of the Constitution. Yet, evidently, it happens, and the Union spends a lot of time overseas in um, making sure they still have the support of other European countries. And I think that is a really, really interesting and good point. Um, and kind of moving on, why do you think that Americans have spent generations really debating the meaning of the Civil War,
Mhm.
and oftentimes getting it wrong, as you're saying now?
Yeah, my dissertation advisor at Yale, the Pulitzer Prize winning historian David Blight, he used to say that so long as we have a politics of race in the United States, we'll have a politics of Civil War memory. And I'm not certain that I can really improve upon that. I think there's a lot to that insight. I
Very
think
eloquently stated.
um,
Yeah,
yeah, I think um, the way that we remember the Civil War is very often bound up in contemporary ideas about race, about belonging in our own particular moments, right? It's about, something as canonical and foundational as birthright citizenship,
yeah.
right? So, because the Civil War is this crucible of race, democracy, and citizenship, every time, right, we are debating in the public square those ideas, right, what's at stake is, of course, the Civil War. And so long as race, democracy, and citizenship, the boundaries of those things continued to be debated, we're going to be worrying about the Civil War.
And I think especially today, we see even more debates about that when we talk about Confederate monuments that remain in the South,
Mhm.
or even school curriculum, or even oftentimes we see people debating the causes of the Civil War. When
Yeah.
do you ever think that this is something new to the 21st century, or are all these modern debates just conversations that have been ebbing and flowing and repeating for the better half of 150 years now?
Well, when back in 2017 and then again in 2020 in the wake of George Floyd and the racial unrest of that COVID summer, um, it became you heard this in the national media quite a lot that these calls for Confederate monuments to come down
Yeah,
were presentist, right? That they were entirely rooted in concerns over the present. And nobody had ever called for these monuments to come down before. And as a historian, I mean, right, our my job is often to remind people that nothing under the sun is really new, that everything has a history, and indeed, calls for Confederate monuments. I mean, the things, when the things went up in the late 19th century, right? Union veterans were out there protesting, saying this is a terrible idea, right? What kind of nation erects monuments to the leaders of a failed rebellion against it?
sure.
Um, the Grand Army of the Republic, the large fraternal society for Union veterans, it administered a lot of the battlefield sites in the late 19th century, and they actually had a prohibition on Confederate monuments and no Confederate monuments, right? Our national cemetery system was initially devised, right, to be exclusively for the Union dead. So this idea that, Confederate monuments have only recently become controversial is just bunk. I mean, they've been controversial since the moment that they were first proposed, the moment that they were erected. Union veterans and African Americans alike were staging protests and writing newspaper editorials, kind of counter protests, especially in Richmond on Monument Avenue. So yeah, they that history of Civil War memory, right? Even that has a very long and complicated past.
Yeah, and I think that long and complicated past is interesting that you bring up because I feel like Americans are very quick to simplify the Civil War,
Mhm.
even
Yeah,
as you were talking about with the name. Now,
yeah,
why do you think that the American people in general, even in our education system, where
yeah.
I was just talking to a historian a few days ago,
Mm,
and I learned that unless you took AP U.S. History in Ohio,
mm,
your education experience of 11th grade starts in I think 18 like
yeah,
70, right when the Civil War ends, which I
yeah.
thought was mind blowing for someone who
Hmm.
lives in New York, a much more democratic leaning area where
Yeah.
our history, of
Yeah.
course, talks more about the nuances. Why do you think Americans are so drawn to this more simplified version that kind of looks on America in a more favorable light?
Well, William Dean Howells, the great 19th century journalist, he w once said that Americans love a tragedy with a happy ending, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. Um, the literary scholar Richard Slotkin, he actually said that the structuring metaphor of the American experience is regeneration through violence. This idea that we have to suffer, endure some suffering or sacrifice in order to come out all the stronger, right? He says
Yeah,
that idea is kind of baked into the American DNA. If you go back to the early colonists to the winter at Valley Forge to the Civil War, right? This idea that you have to suffer, right, in order to emerge stronger. That's an intoxicating idea, and it may be, as Slotkin suggests, this structuring metaphor for the American experience.
yeah,
But I think in the case of the Civil War, we've always preferred valor and glory and gleaming bayonets to the gruesome reality of the human costs of the war. But that's also served very well those who want to ignore the consequences of the war, the charge of the war, right? Which is creating that more perfect union, creating a government that's truly of, by, and for the people, wrestling with all of the issues that the war tees up for us. Again, citizenship, black suffrage, black social, civil, and political rights. Right? If you make the Civil War, if you kind of hermetically seal the Civil War off from the rest of the 19th century and say, oh, it's this, backyard scrimmage and we met to fight and then shake hands, it not only fits into that larger idea of suffering to come out stronger, but it actually sort of absolves you of wrestling with the more complicated ideological issues at the heart of the conflict, and kind of absolves you of wrestling with those things in the public square today. So I think we would much prefer to say it's something that happened in the past and it couldn't happen again, rather than to say, look, this was not a great triumph of democracy. This was the greatest failing of democracy, and God forbid it could happen again.
no, I think you're absolutely right. It's a situation that attacks American comfort.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I think Reconstruction itself is a great example of that.
Yeah.
Um, the eventual failures of Reconstruction, with the South ending up electing most of its Confederate leaders back up into positions of
Yeah.
power.
Oh yeah.
Um, but that's a very harsh reality that we live in, and one that most people are willing and want to ignore to show that kind of what you're saying, that the Civil War, quick and done battle and makes us all better. And confronting those realities are often very hard because it means looking at ourselves.
Oh, that's absolutely right, Jay. And yeah, I mean, Civil War Americans, as you point out, are they're doing this literally in real time during Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Um, and before we you know uh, cast too much judgment on the people of the past. I mean, look at our own particular moment, right?
Yeah,
You can look at something like January 6th, which already has this sort of revisionist narrative about it, where we have people who, despite, right? I mean, January 6th being half a decade ago, people already contesting the meaning of that day, the intention of
for
those folks
sure.
on
Yeah.
that day. And you can see, right, that there is something I would dare to argue intrinsically American about the way that, rather than confront these really difficult moments that have potentially powerful lessons, we call it something else and look the other way.
Yeah, and I think your work shows a lot of the deeply personal moments of the war. Um, Spending time looking at veterans through letters, diaries, and records. Has your own perspective on the Civil War
Mm.
changed because of that, from what you initially believed coming into your field and now years later?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I had sort of a traditional training as a Civil War historian. I was trained in military, diplomatic, and political history. And when you do that, right, I mean, a lot of it is studying the battles and the tactics and the strategies, and it's easy to forget that those rectangles, triangles, and arrows on battlefield maps are individual people,
Yeah,
right? And you read their letters and diaries, you become intimately acquainted with them. You get to know them when you spend so much time with them in the archive, and you realize that, yeah, all of those dots on the maps are individual lives with people who had families and dreams, and um, that can't help but make the story all the more tragic and all the more real. So, and it complicates. I don't think it's possible to understand the military history unless you understand, right, that those regiments are harvested from communities that concerns of those communities are then manifested in the attitudes and the behaviors and the ideas of the soldiers in the ranks, and that finds tactical articulation on the ground. So yeah, it will change you to read those letters. The Civil War soldiers are remarkably eloquent. They wrote beautiful letters. We don't write like that anymore. And I think that's one reason we write so many books about the Civil War, and people like you and me are so fascinated by the period, is that they left so much behind that we can access those gritty details almost in real time.
yeah, I think that's put perfectly. That reading these personal accounts makes the story more personal, makes you invested in those dots and triangles and squares on the map that many people is their only real experience in studying the Civil Wars in schools
Yeah,
through that more bird's eye view picture of it rather than that frontline experience.
yeah, that's
And
right.
many of your books explore questions that actually go um, beyond just even the front line and talk about deeper themes like democracy, citizenship, and national identity, the themes that present themselves in the front line through these letters. What does the
Mhm.
Civil War reveal about the strengths and vulnerabilities of American democracy?
Well, I think it reveals one that our institutions, the structures of democracy, are only as good as the people who are defending them. Um, and that I think is the real one of the real lessons of the Civil War. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, who is from the famous Beecher family. His sister Harriet, of course, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the first American bestsellers, 1850s. He was a celebrated preacher from Brooklyn, New York, and uh, one of the most famous orators of the day. He was asked, Henry Ward Beecher, to give remarks at Fort Sumter on April 14th, 1865, 4 years to the day that The fort was bombarded into submission by the rebels. They
Yeah.
returned the United States flag to the flagstaff above Fort Sumter. It's actually the very day that Lincoln is going to be assassinated.
Hmm.
Uh, so a lot of people forget this ceremony because it gets overshadowed by the great tragedy that night. But Beecher goes back to Fort Sumter. Bunch of abolitionists are there. William Lloyd Garrison, George Thompson, Robert Smalls, who stole the planter. They're all there. It's kind of a who's who of Civil War history. And Beecher says um, something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, we we knew our institutions, we understood our institutions before the Civil War. But now, in the wake of this war, where we mobilized over, nearly 2 million Union soldiers, ordinary people from the Midwest, from New England, from New York, came together to save the Union, save this idea of self-government because they knew that if self-government, if democracy failed here, right, it was on the run elsewhere across the globe. It was going to have no hope. He said, we knew before this war our institutions, our structures of government. He says, now that we've suppressed the rebellion and we've come together, we've ended slavery, right? Um, tallies all of the important things that the war had accomplished in the name of national integration, things like the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad Bill. He says, now we know the power of those institutions, and the power of those institutions is the people, right?
Yeah.
And today we can be so apathetic, we can be so checked out, we can doom scroll, we can say, our vote doesn't matter, our voice doesn't matter, there's too much money in politics, it's all you know and that's absolutely the wrong lesson, right? The real lesson of the war is that if um you know you uh, you have the ability to save our democracy. You have the ability to affect that change, to accomplish the seemingly impossible. I mean, 3 years before the Civil War and the Dred Scott decision, right? Supreme Court declared that African Americans had no rights a white man was bound to respect, right? 8 years later, because of the Civil War, right? You have emancipation, you have an American president uttering support for suffrage rights. Fast forward another 5 years, you've got formerly enslaved men serving in Congress, right? Um, our institutions are it's a beautiful system of checks and balances and of federalism that our framers devised in Philadelphia all those years ago. But it means nothing if you're not engaged.
Thank you. Yeah. And finally, what is one lesson you hope that people take away, not just about the Civil War, but about the country that we live in today?
Yeah, I think the certainly the lesson from my period is that democracy is fragile. Um, Civil War holds up a mirror to the best hopes and to the worst urges of democracy. Um, and we always have to be on guard. We have to be vigilant. Um, and and that's the real lesson. There's no greater threat to democracy than apathy.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you being here.
Oh, I so appreciate you, Jay, and congratulations on this wonderful series.
Thank you.